Good morning. Still morning, right? Yes, and it's so great that you all show up, right? I went to a school where you had to show up, and actually we had assigned seats, and we had folks in a balcony making sure we weren't studying, talking, or sleeping, because we got 1/3 absence if we were. Anyway, appreciate you being here. I want to start, a few years ago, I went on retreat with my spiritual director. He took a group of us to this Benedictine monastery out in the middle of nowhere in the cornfields of Nebraska. It was a silent retreat for us, but as my spiritual director was sort of facilitating this, he told us a story. And the story went like this. He was sharing about a lecture that he gave at a Catholic elementary school in town in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, my spiritual director is this 70-year-old, crusty Irish Jesuit priest, and he's a son of a gun. And so I'm trying to think dude must have been scaring these little kids, right? Anyway, after his presentation, this little girl, probably in grade 4, came up to him, and she began to have a conversation with Father Gillick. And halfway through the conversation, she realized that he couldn't see. And so she just blurted out in his face. She said, "You're blind," right? So that's true. Father Gillick, he lost his sight when he was 8 years old. He bends down in front of this little girl, and he goes, "Honey, that's not a surprise to me." And before he could say anything else, she went from pure astonishment to deep, deep sadness, and she said, "You don't know what you look like." So it caught him off guard. He was like, man, what an amazing thing for a little child to just suddenly go to. And before he could respond to that, from sadness, she went to real, genuine affection, and she said, "You're beautiful." And I think about that story all the time, because I think a lot of us have our vision of ourselves obscured. We don't know who we are. We don't know what we look like. And it often takes the so-called unlikely other to show us that, to remind us that, to speak that truth for us and to speak that truth over us. So I understand this semester you all are going to be sort of unpacking conversations around fear. And I actually think that's really, I think that's amazing. I think fear is maybe the most common human experience. And man, if you turn on the news, you see how fear has become a weapon. We use fear as violence to control. Our politicians have failed us. Religion uses fear to scare us. Religion uses fear to malform our notions of God and divine love. And so to face this and to be honest with it and to actually learn to have a healthy relationship with something that is normal and natural, I think is a sign of the evolution of our collective human consciousness. And it is what will heal the world. It's what will allow the new we that we're all yearning and longing for to be midwived, to be birthed, right? So fear. I don't want to beat the drum of fear. I don't want to use fear to manipulate myself, and I imagine neither do you. But I do think that as folks who probably have been socialized in religious communities, we often don't know how to relate to fear or what our fears really are. And so I think when we start these conversations, we have to name that fears are simply malformations of the truth, right? My wife and I lived in this gorgeous brown brick townhouse that was built in the 1920s. And you know what? On Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m., if I heard a creak on the floor, I'd be like, man, this charming old home, I love it. But at 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning, if I heard a creak on the floor downstairs, look, I prefer nonviolence, but somebody better not be in my house. Nothing changed, right? Except for my ability to sort of accurately narrate, to accurately relate to the reality of what time it was on my clock. And you see, that's the power that a lot of us give our fears. So 20 years ago, I was visiting a friend in the slums of Cambodia, him and his wife. His wife was actually a survivor of the Khmer Rouge genocide in the 70s. She was a refugee. She went to New Zealand where she met her husband. They moved back to Cambodia, and to this day, they do amazing work. I was visiting these friends, and over lunch, one of them asked me, "Hey, man, have you ever heard of this thing called the Enneagram?" And I hadn't. I don't know if you've seen the Enneagram, but it looks super evil, like 2 pentagrams having sex. And I was like, I don't think I'm allowed to learn about this. And he began to describe this to me. And as he began to describe it to me, of course, there's something in me that resisted it, that wanted to push against it, that was like, yeah, man, I don't really play those games. I'm not going to let you back me into a corner. but actually it was one of the most profound tools in terms of understanding my relationship to fear. So the Enneagram, if you've not heard of this, in 2019, folks have essentially sort of reduced it down to a personality profile teaching or tool. But actually, the history is much more complex and deeper than that. If you have heard of this, you're probably just like, seriously, man? This is worn out, used up, I'm tired of hearing it. So I'm going to try to give maybe some fresh language to this, right? When I talk about the Enneagram of personality, basically what I think and what I try to share with folks is this teaching shows us our ego set of coping addictions that we've wrapped up around our childhood wounds so that we don't have to tell ourselves the truth about who we really are. That's it, right? Because most of us actually don't want to know who we truly are. Most of us actually prefer to stay asleep. And the truth is most of us don't know that we don't know who we are, right? So what we'd rather do is over-identify with aspects of our personality. What we would rather do is trick out and build out the projection of our own ego mythology and then build scaffolding around that. And you know what we typically do in the process of building that scaffolding around the projection of our ego mythology is we build that out with our fears. So what the Enneagram does in very compassionate, gentle ways is it says there's 9 ways, right? There's 9 archetypes for human character structure, and there's 9 ways of showing us what these fears are. And the truth is if we could actually learn in healthy ways to relate to these fears, we strip them of the power and the control that they have over us, right? So I sometimes think of this story, right? If you remember in the Gospel of St. John, it's in the 9th chapter, Jesus and the guys are hanging out, and they come across a person who was born blind, right? And the disciples are really upset about this injustice, this suffering, this thing that has somehow caused pain in this individual's life, and so the disciples want to ascribe blame. And that's what we do. We all, in a sense, are looking for targets to land our blame. The disciples ask Jesus, they say, who sinned? Was this child the one who sinned so that they were born blind, or did this person's parents do something, and now this child has to carry the punishment of their parents' sin? And Jesus looked at the disciples and said, actually, there's no sin here. This happened so that the kingdom of God, so that the love of God, so that the presence of divine love could be born, could come forward. And my sense is this. I think a lot of us, as we don't want to tell ourselves the truth about who we are, my sense is as a lot of us would really prefer to stay asleep in the illusions of this loss of contact with our true selves, this loss of contact with our essence, we want to blame somebody else. We want to blame our imperfect early holding environments. We want to blame a parent or a caregiver. We want to blame for some of us, and I'm sorry, the real trauma that maybe we experienced as children as the reason we stay stuck, as the reason we stay lost, as the reason that we don't know who we are. But my sense is even our fears actually can lead us to truth. Our fears can actually lead us to wholeness. And when we, like I said, with compassion, face them, welcome them, and make peace with them, right, we strip the power of them. So, the Enneagram, right? The Enneagram tells us, like I said, that there's 9 ways of being ourselves. There's 9 compassionate sketches of possibilities for who you can become when you say yes to yourself, when you say yes to love. And when I learned this, I learned this from my first teacher, this Franciscan friar down in New Mexico, this man named Father Richard Rohr. He used to teach it like this, that the first type of person, which is sometimes called the perfectionist or the reformer, has this fundamental need to be perfect. And if this is you, if you're the Enneagram type 1, your basic fear, right, and your basic fear in 9 different ways is simply this: I'll never get back to my true self. Well, if you're a type 1, it's that you're somehow inherently corrupt, that you're morally defunct, that there's something tragically and irredeemably flawed in you. But man, if you're dominant in Enneagram type 1, you're actually a source of perfection and goodness and serenity. And the perfection that you bring forward as the purposed gift of your being, why God created you and blessed the world with your life, is that you remind us that it's our imperfections that make us beautiful. It's what's flawed in us that makes us safe. It reminds us this is where grace becomes tangible, becomes realized. Now, if you're a type 2, this is sometimes called the helper or the giver, and this is the person who has this need to be needed. And the basic fear for folks who are dominant in type 2 is that you're not loved for who you are, but you're only loved for what you give others. And there's a deep sadness in that. Because if you're type 2, you really were purposed and born to bring forward sort of this nurturing brace of acceptance. And you make room for everybody, but sometimes not yourself. Because you think you have to earn the love that you're so freely and generously sharing with everybody else in your life. But you don't have to do that. There's nothing that needs to be earned in love, or it's not love. In fact, we align with the gifts that have been ascribed to us simply because of the divine nature, the divine imprint, and our gift of being human. If you're type 3, this is sometimes called the performer or the achiever, right? And they used to say that this is the individual who has the need to succeed. And that bums me out, especially if you're a 3 here, because it's not that you're more ambitious than everyone else around you. It's just that in 9 different ways, we're all suffering this loss of contact from love. And in 9 ways, we're trying to feel love. We're trying to receive love. And so if you're a 3, when you're a little kid, you may have wondered, how do I feel the emptiness in my own heart? Well, I'll do that through accomplishments, through recognition, through getting attention, and especially from the adults in my life. And as a little child, that worked for you. And so as you became a young adult and into your adulthood, there was a drive to be the best that you could. Because for the 3s, there's this basic fear that you somehow do not have intrinsic value. And so what you do is you add value to everything you do. You add significance to all the people in your life to make them what you think, to make them more capable of being loved or lovable, so that you'll be capable of receiving the love that you want. But look, if you're a 3, you were born to be a source of truth. And like I said, the truth is that you don't have to earn these things. If you're a 3, you're a source of authenticity in the world, and you can see that with clarity and precision. It comes natural for you. And so to align with that is remembering who you always were. Now, if you're a 4, right? Poor 4s. And this is sort of a joke, but it's like if we were like, hey, how many Enneagram 4s in the room? And like 12 of you raised your hand, all 12 of you would look around and say, actually, those folks aren't 4 enough. I'm probably the only 4. So there's only one 4 in every room. But this is the individualist. This is the tragic romantic. I love to refer to the 4s as the divas with all affection, because this is the need to be unique. And the real pain here for the 4 is they're afraid that they don't have a sense of significance rooted in their notion of self. They're afraid that they don't know who they are. They're afraid that they don't belong. They're afraid that somewhere along the way in their childhood, they lost grasp of their identity. And so they spend the rest of their lives ascribing significance and seeing and pulling beauty out of everything around them as a way of hopefully seeing the beauty that might actually be hidden in them. But that's the thing, if you're a 4, you're born to bring that significance forward, to show us the holy origin that we all are purposed and destined, and that all of our souls exist for a reason. And so the poor 4, man, they suffer that loss, and they suffer that pain. And just like all of us in 9 different ways, give power to that fear that they don't fit in, that there's something profoundly missing. And that's what makes them wrong or lost or trapped in this suffering. Now, if you're a 5, this is sometimes called the observer, the investigator. In Spanish, they call the 5 the theorist. And this is the need to understand. And the basic fear here for the 5 is of not being able to uncover the essence of truth, to not be able to get to the bottom of every question that you think is driving and keeping solutions from allowing wholeness and healing to take root in the world. And in fact, 5s are in their heads, and 5s are just like 4s, really among some of the most misunderstood people in our communities, in our lives. But 5s, I think, are actually less concerned about getting to the answers, and they're more concerned about asking the right questions. And this fear that you might not even know what the right questions are drives you. But if you're a 5, you were purposed and born to be a source of non-attachment, of the peace of arriving at conclusions, analyzing and sussing things out, and then being able to give those and gift those and share those with your community and with your world. Now again, just like we would see this in 9 different ways, the more power you give to the fear, the less capable you are of releasing and sharing and presenting your gifts, right? Now, if you're a 6, right, this is sometimes called the loyalist or the skeptic, right? If you're a 6, you're probably sitting there with your arms folded saying, this is made up, man. And somebody made it up, but the 6 is fundamentally, they have this need to be secure, that stability is really important to them. And they suffer this fear that they can't trust themselves, that they have to doubt themselves, that something will go wrong. And so 6s are incredible threat forecasters, incredible contingency planners, right? If you're a 6, you go to the worst case scenario in your mind and you double down on that. And partly why you're doing that is because you want to take care and love the people in your lives, and so you want to keep us safe as well. But the problem with that is when you give power over to the fear that you have to second guess yourself, that you can't believe in yourself, then it actually sort of winds into some anxiety, and it can sometimes come across a little panicky. Now 6s in this conversation around fear play a really important role in our lives and in our communities because you are purposed to be a source of strength, of faith, of courage. And you'll probably hear this, it probably will become cliche over the semester, but courage isn't not being afraid, it's pressing into the things that actually you are afraid of. It's actually having a healthy relationship with your fears, and 6s can show us that. Now, if you're 7, you are a frustrated idealist, and you may just be ridiculous, right? 7s are called the enthusiasts, and this is the need to avoid pain. And the fear here is of getting trapped in your own pain. And so if you're a 7, you may come across as really playful, imaginative, curious. The ridiculousness of you keeps all of us sort of in these beautiful places of levity and joy. But man, if you're a 7, you're also a really quick thinker. In fact, you may be the best problem solvers in the room, and the problem that you've solved is how you don't have to face your own pain. Now, if you're 7, you may experience a real disconnect from your own heart. And so this is why 7s make really great therapists or humanitarians, because you can get close to other people's pain and not be emotionally drawn into it. But that fear that you would somehow be trapped in your own pain is what keeps you stuck. And you being stuck doesn't help us receive the gift of your presence, which really is an invitation to explore freedom and to be truly free. Now, if you're an 8, right, this is the challenger, this is the contrarian. These are the sons of guns in the world. And even though they hate bullies, they're sometimes the biggest bully, right? This is the need to be against. And if you're 8 on the Enneagram, you really are afraid of not being in control. When you're not in control, look out, because you will act out, and you will act out with aggression at times. But man, 8s are also, and they don't want y'all to know this, but they're some of the most tender folks in the Enneagram because they're trying to protect what was lost in their childhood. And so they do that by protecting vulnerabilities and what they perceive to be sensitivities around them. And again, if you are an 8 and you give power to that fear that you aren't in control, then you'll never be in control of the gift that you bring forward in terms of establishing justice, of being a protective force of love in the world. And finally, the last type here are the 9s, right? And these are sometimes called the mediators or the peacemakers. 9s are incredible arbitrators. They have this incredible capacity to understand everyone, but they do this at their own expense because this is simply the need to avoid. And so if you're a 9 on the Enneagram, there's something in your early holding environment that was important to you, but you minimized it and you hid it from the people in your lives because as a source of love, you wanted to make what was important to them more important to you than what was important to yourself. And so if you're a 9, you actually have to bring these things forward. You have to remember who you were because 9s fundamentally are a source of love, and you show us that. Now, if this is old news to you, sorry. If this is new news to you, hopefully this is an introduction to starting to look more truthfully at ourselves, by actually looking at how we've lost contact with our essence, our true self, the gift for our being here, and how we've given power to these 9 basic fears that keep us stuck. Now, knowing this is helpful, because if we can't self-observe, clearly we cannot self-correct. But simply knowing this and simply sort of fixating on this and obsessing about this becomes narcissistic. So what do we do with it? Well, I think we take this into how we nurture and nourish our spirituality. And so I imagine if you were socialized in a historic Christian faith tradition and that was located within a Protestant worshiping community, you may not have been connected or formed within the historic Christian contemplative tradition, right? And there's sort of happened to us historically, right? The Great Schism, when the Pope in the Western Church, right, the Catholic Pope, excommunicated the Pope in the Eastern Church, right, the Orthodox Pope, and the Orthodox Pope excommunicated the Catholic Pope, we had this great schism, right? Well, unfortunately, it was the contemplative practices, it was contemplative spirituality that was really being incubated in the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox Church, so that after this great schism, the Catholic Church didn't want to have anything to do with that. And they stopped studying the mothers and fathers of the early Christian monastic movements. They stopped studying the doctors of the early Christian contemplative tradition. And then, of course, you have Martin Luther knocking on the church door trying to reform what he thought was the whole thing, but actually it was just half of it. So we're sort of the orphan fourth. And we took a further step away from the historic Christian contemplative tradition that was rooted in the East. But when we talk about contemplative spirituality, and if this is, again, old news to you, fabulous, if this is new news to you, we're not talking specifically about specific practices, but we're talking about how do we frame these practices. And I think we frame these practices around solitude, silence, and stillness as postures, as corrections to what's out of control in our lives, right? So solitude. Look, I imagine probably everybody who lives on campus here has a roommate or two-ish. And I imagine some of you who maybe don't live on campus might have 3 or 4 roommates. I imagine most of us, if we go to the market, if we go to the coffee shop, if we're alone, we still have these phones out because we're never alone. Some of us can't stand being alone. And it doesn't matter how great your friends are, it doesn't matter how many roommates you share, some of you still suffer the profound pain of feeling lonely, and you're not sure why. Well, solitude teaches us to be present. It teaches us to be present to ourselves, present to God, and present to one another. It's the overcorrection to that loss, that suffering, that fear. Silence. Look, in 2019, it's out of control. I don't want to look at my phone when it reminds me every week of my daily usage. I'm ashamed of myself because we're addicted. Many of us are addicted to the digital distractions that come along with these devices in our pockets, in our purses, in our backpacks. We don't know how to listen anymore. And I hate to say it, if after chapel a couple of us went out and grabbed a cup of coffee, I bet you my phone would be on the table in between us, and that bums me out. But that's sort of the state of where a lot of us have gotten. Well, silence teaches us to listen, and first and foremost to listen to ourselves so that we can tell ourselves the truth, so that we can strip the power of these fears. It teaches us to listen to the inner voice of love, to the divine voice that calls you son or daughter or beloved child, and it teaches us to listen to each other. And finally, stillness. Look, in 2019, I imagine most of us here at least have a couple social causes that we care about, right? For 25 years of my life, I have given a lot of my professional, vocational fidelity to anti-human trafficking work around the world. And a lot of my closest friends in 2019 are actually survivors of trafficking. Some of us care about clean drinking water. Some of us care about saving and healing and caring for the environment. We could go through the hit list of what these causes are, fabulous, but I will tell you the truth, history will not absolve us for the unintended harmful consequences of even our best intentions and our best efforts in the world. And that's where stillness is so important, because in stillness we learn restraint, and in restraint we learn discernment, and in discernment we learn how to say yes, and we know what it is that we're supposed to give ourselves to. And so solitude, silence, and stillness become the corrections to what's out of control in our lives, but it also becomes the way that we hold It becomes the postures that we bring to how we nurture and nourish our spirituality. And if we can bring a contemplative mind, and if we can bring contemplative practices into how we hold and face these basic fears, how we relate to the ways that we've gotten lost, then yes, our eyes will be open and we will find new ways of getting home to our true selves and returning back to our essence. So, right? I was on retreat with my spiritual director. And at the end of the retreat, I was going to drive Father Gillick back to Omaha. Now, when I picked him up on the front side of that retreat, and we got in my car, I typed in the address to the monastery on like one of those old school GPS things that we stuck on the inside of windshields. Remember that? Where you guys are like, oh, 4th grade, man, cool. We drove out of his driveway, and I named the voice on my GPS Samantha, and Samantha goes, in 2 blocks, turn left. And Father Gil goes, what's that? And I go, oh, this is the GPS that's going to help us get to the monastery. He goes, oh, well, this will be interesting. And I was like, huh? And as we were driving to the monastery, this is no joke, this man who could not see would correct Samantha's directions. He'd be like, oh, no, don't turn here. Keep going straight. I know a quicker way. And I was like, what? And he did this. He did this 2 or 3 times to the monastery. So on the way home, we're loading up the car. I get the GPS out, and Father Gil goes, oh, we won't need that. I can get us back to Omaha. And I was like, what? And sure enough, started to drive through these country roads, these country highways, and Father Gil could say, hey, coming up here on the left, there's going to be an exit. I want you to take that. And y'all, within like a mile and a half, there it was. We drive a little bit further. He'd say, hey, we're going to be coming under a bridge here in a second, and I want you to take the next right. And as soon as he would say that, we were driving right under the bridge, and I'm just like, what in the world, right? We kept driving. He'd roll down the window and say, hey, do you want me to put the air conditioner on? He's like, oh, no, there's some train tracks up here, and I love to hear the trains fly by. As soon as he said that, boom, there it goes. So I'm losing my mind. I'm just like, what is going on with this guy? Anyway, drop him off at his community center. I go home. My wife's like, man, how was the retreat? I was like, how was the retreat? How was the ride home? And I began to tell her. And even to this day, I still can't believe, right, that those 90 minutes in the car with that man. But you see, that's what happens when we begin to set down the old ways of relating to the malformations of who we never were meant to be. When we set down through contemplative practice the ways that we have given power over our fears, and we begin to live freely, we will find new ways of seeing and new ways of being led home, back to your true self, back to your essential nature. And so may that be your task this semester. Thank you.